Well, hello everybody joining us online. My name is Frank Gray. I'm going to be your instructor for session 3 in Reasons to Believe, Tough Questions, Biblical Answers. Today we're tackling one of the toughest questions of all. Doesn't evolution explain everything? Stay tuned. I think you're going to enjoy the ride. Let me make a disclaimer right up front. This subject makes me just a teeny weeny bit uncomfortable because it is very scientific in nature. And yet I am not a scientist. I've not been trained in that. I have spent some time just recently thinking about my areas of competence. I can identify one or two. Science is not among them. So, why would I be qualified to teach this class? It's because even though evolution is a scientific subject, I think it's more fundamental than that. I think evolution is a religious issue. I think evolution is a faith issue. And I think I'm going to be able to demonstrate that very powerfully by the end of this session in the words of those who believe in evolution. And I use those words very intentionally, believe in evolution and all of its religious overtones, because I think you'll see as we go through this in just a few minutes that the choice to believe in evolution is not so much a scientific decision as it is a faith decision. Just as much as anybody believes in any other religion, I believe it's the same motivations that lead a person to choose evolution as their faith position. That may sound confusing, but I think it'll be very clear as we work our way through. Let's get started. First of all, the definition. What is evolution? I'm leaning on our friends at Merriam-Webster for the answer here. It is A, the process by which new species or populations of living things develop from pre-existing forms through successive generations. That sounds very much like the definition of evolution that we're all familiar with. And then B, the scientific theory explaining the appearance of new species and varieties through the action of various biologic mechanisms. We typically think of those mechanisms as natural selection or genetic mutation. And I noted the emphasis in these definitions on the phrase new species. We're going to define that more carefully as we go through the class today, but it's very important that evolution, as defined here and as taught in public schools and graduate schools around the world, really deals with the creation, the appearance of new species. So hang on, we'll get there. The stages of evolution, as I have described them, and probably as you have learned them, if you had a good public school education, you probably have seen charts like the one on the screen, the human evolution infographic. And I broke it down again in real simple, broad categories into 8 stages. Number 1, the creation of the universe from nothing. And you may immediately say, well, what in the world does that have to do with evolution? I mean, the creation of the world is all about, chemicals and stardust and all of that. But the evolutionist has to answer the question, where did these inert chemicals come from that spontaneously generated into life? And so I think you have to go all the way back to the very beginning to give this subject a fair hearing. So first stage, creation of the universe from nothing. 2, non-living chemicals, inert chemicals that come together and are suddenly energized in some manner. Think about Back to the Future and the lightning strike on the clock tower. There has to be some outside source of energy impacting these inert chemicals. And the top choices by scientists are the oceanic heat vents down deep in the ocean, volcanoes, or lightning. Some outside energizing force impacted these inert chemicals and spontaneously generated a single cell organism that was capable of reproducing itself and did so in the depths of the ocean. that single cell organism, somehow by mechanisms unknown, evolved into a multi-cell organism. That multi-cell organism eventually became fish, then amphibians, which amphibians made the journey outside the watery world of the sea onto land. Think frogs and toads. And then amphibians evolved into reptiles. And I say that with some hesitancy because Darwinists debate the order of whether it was reptiles who evolved into birds or birds into reptiles. But just for discussion's sake, we're going to say it was reptiles, then birds, and then birds evolved into mammals. And within mammals, the evolutionary schema is along the lines of rats to apes, and then finally to humans. So there we go. Hopefully I didn't say anything that you have not heard Darwinists teach and affirm hundreds of times in your educational career. Now, let's just pause for a comedic break for just a moment. Ron Carlson said very famously that in grammar school, they taught him that a frog turning into a prince was a fairy tale. And yet when he got to graduate school, he was taught that a frog turning into a prince was a fact. And truer words have not been spoken. That is exactly the evolutionary stage that I just described to you, from fish to amphibians to reptiles to birds, and then finally to mammals, including man. So there you have it. All right, here's the format that we are following in this Reasons to Believe series. The tough question, here it is. Doesn't evolution explain everything? We're taught that evolution explains everything. And so we're going to respond to that with a biblical answer. Straightforward, no. It doesn't explain everything. God created the universe. God created all living things according to their kinds or species. And God created living things with the ability to adapt to different or changing environmental conditions, an ability sometimes referred to as microevolution. I'm going to go a little bit deeper on that in just a moment. Varying environmental conditions, as well as human efforts to develop breeds with special characteristics, has led to many varieties within a species. For example, wolves and poodles are of the same species, just as quarter horses and Shetland ponies are of the same species. This differentiation within a species is what we call microevolution, as opposed to macroevolution, which would be a change from one species to another. Microevolution is observed every day all over the world, even within humans. Macroevolution, I'm going to contend, and I believe demonstrate pretty persuasively, has never happened. And let me just share with you an example. Just this morning, I came across a quote from an atheistic Darwinist who was making fun of the belief that Adam and Eve were the first humans and that all humans descended from Adam and Eve. And he was saying, well, if you don't believe in evolution, which one was Hispanic and which one was black and which one was white? As if human beings have never experienced microevolution in the thousands and thousands of years that we have existed. The scripture has no issue whatsoever with microevolution. Clearly, it is seen, it is in accordance with the scientific method. It can be demonstrated again and again that that has happened. It's the macroevolution, the rat turning into the kangaroo, turning into the human, that we have issue with. And here's reasons to believe that the biblical answer is correct. There's no other explanation for the existence of the universe, no other viable, credible explanation. It has never been offered. There are lots of theories, and I'm going to go through them with you again in just a moment, but none of them are scientifically credible. There is no natural mechanism for creating life. And I don't care how often you watch Back to the Future, how many lightning strikes, how many oceanic vents. How many laboratories funded with United Nations funding? It has never happened. It will never happen. Human beings cannot create life. Life cannot create itself. There must be an outside cause, and that cause is none other than God himself. And then finally, there's no fossil record or other evidence of one species evolving into another, i.e., amoebas don't evolve into humans. There is no fossil support for macroevolution. And I'm going to pause right there. It may be a little early in the game to kind of get into, debate mode, but scientists can certainly come up with fossils. Archaeologists have uncovered all kinds of wonderful fossils from lots of eons of previous generations. But where evolution goes wrong is in trying to say that there is a succession of one of these fossils to another, to another, to another, and eventually you start with a rat and you end up with a kangaroo, and that is way beyond the bounds of scientific credibility. Because just because you have several fossils who bear some resemblance to each other, there is absolutely no proof, there's no evidence, there's no mechanism for saying that one evolved into the other. All right, I should have gotten ahead of myself like that. So let's dive into these reasons for believing the biblical answer. The first one, there is no credible explanation for the existence of the universe other than the fact that God created it. And I went into much more depth on this issue in a previous week where we talked about the cosmological argument. So I'm just going to answer this in one slide. As we discussed in a previous lesson, all alternative theories of the origin of the universe are based on pure speculation. And I realize some very powerful, well-known, respected, Nobel Prize-winning scientists have put forth these theories about the origin of the universe, but they are completely unsupported by any scientific facts. Gravity created the universe. That's a Stephen Hawking. Multiverses created the universe. The universe created itself. And then finally, growing in popularity, the view that the universe is merely an illusion. There is no universe, and therefore it was never created, and we don't really exist, and you're not watching this video. This table is not real. Nothing is real. Believe it or not, that is a perspective that's gaining credibility in the scientific community. And why not? Because they don't want to admit the simple message of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The uncaused cause, the only credible explanation for the beginning of the universe. Without the universe, right, evolution falls apart. There are no chemicals to form the building blocks of life and no conditions conducive to life. And God is the only credible explanation for where it all came from. So we can lose all this silliness about an infinity of universes. That doesn't even answer the beginning. If there's an infinity of universes, where was the first one and who created it? If gravity created the universe, who created gravity? The universe created itself. Well, I mean, that is a philosophical and logical impossibility. It cannot create itself. We've demonstrated that in a previous lesson. So there's no other credible explanation for the existence of the universe other than the message of Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God. Two, second reason for believing the biblical answer, there's no other explanation for the origin of life. No other viable, credible, scientific answer for the origin of life other than the fact that God spoke life into being. Now, I say that with some humor because there have been so many attempts over the years and ongoing attempts right now to create life in the laboratory, and it's almost silly to see how these experiments are reported. For example, in the 1950s, Miller and Urey, professors at the University of Chicago, conducted experiments to replicate the conditions of the young Earth to try to recreate life. So they In the lab, they put the chemical conditions together, the atmospheric conditions together that mimicked the primordial universe, and then they energized it with sparks, recreating lightning, to see if they could create life. Well, they did not create life. They did manage to create a couple amino acids, which you could do in your own kitchen laboratory. There was nothing groundbreaking about that. Nevertheless, the headlines screamed that life had been created in the test tube. Hallelujah, there is no God. We don't need to believe in God. That was the underlying message. And if you think I'm reading too much into the celebratory tone of those headlines, stay tuned. In the 1960s, Science Newsletter dated September 1, 1962, look at the headline, Life Created in Test Tube. The creation of life in a test tube from lifeless chemicals has been achieved simultaneously in 2 U.S. university laboratories. Can you imagine that? Isn't that wonderful news? Yeah, William and Murray didn't quite do it in the 50s like we earlier reported, but now it has all been done at UCLA and Utah State University. Well, not so fast. It wasn't too long before these results were debunked. Nobody else could recreate the results, and nobody ever has, despite the celebratory tone of this headline. Let me share with you just one more, because the 50s and 60s were a long time ago, but this stuff never ends. Literally 3 days ago, this article popped up on my home screen on my computer. This is from Microsoft Health. This was September 29th, 2023. The headline is, Scientists Create Chemical Cookbook with Recipes That Will Create Life. Now, William and Murray just came up with one recipe that they thought created life. They only created a couple amino acids. Who knows what was created in the 1960s? They didn't even identify that in the article. But now we have tons and tons of recipes. Just turn to any page and you can create life in your own home laboratory. Listen to this. The quest to understand the origins of life and the potential for its existence elsewhere in the universe has taken a monumental leap. Listen to the language. A team of researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, led by NASA-supported astrobiologist, so it must be true NASA's involved, has published a chemical cookbook that compiles hundreds of recipes with the, he tones down the language now, with the potential to give rise to life. Isn't it interesting how the headlines so rarely match the content of the articles? That's because those in the news media know that most people will just read the headlines and then go to work the next day and tell everybody, hey, scientists have now a chemical cookbook to create life. We don't need to believe in God. We don't need to believe the Bible, because science is our God and has figured it all out. That is what they would like us to believe. Since the 1950s, scientists have claimed many times to have created life, but they never have. Numerous universities and even NASA have laboratories today dedicated to creating life, but they never have. So think about it. This is the point. With our brightest scientists whipping up intricate chemical cocktails under the most carefully controlled conditions, with the wealth of the world supporting their research, they've never been able to create life. And yet these same scientists, evolutionists, Darwinists, contend that life happened completely by chance, by spontaneous generation without any intelligent oversight. So our brightest scientists can't do it, but just the chance and time mixture of chemicals in the ocean managed to make it happen. Well, like the ape on the screen, that's a thing that makes me go, not so sure about that. Number 3, and this is where we're really going to spend our time. The third reason for believing the biblical answer that God created the world and God created life and God has superintended that life from the beginning. Number 3, there is no fossil evidence for evolution of one species to another. And I know that's going to come as a shock to many of you, because you have seen charts like this your entire life, showing the single cell amoebas turn into multicellular life, all the way to animals, then fish, then mammals, then apes, and then finally humans. But did you know that these things are completely mythological? There is no link from one step to another. Have we found all these fossils? Absolutely. But where is the proof that one has evolved into the other? It is non-existent. You've probably heard the phrase missing link. Well, newsflash, there's not just one missing link. There are millions of missing links because none of these categories have any links to transitioning to a separate species. Now, the scientific community, just like their desperate efforts to create life in a test tube, they have been desperately trying to find that missing link ever since Darwin theorized that evolution explains it all. Let's just talk about Lucy for a moment. Lucy, the skeleton found in Ethiopia just over 40 years ago, who scientists now claim is the missing link between apes and humans. Now, on the right, you're going to see it was just a few bone fragments that were found. And yet the headlines have trumpeted for half a century now that she is the missing link. And by the way, the picture on the left is the artist's rendering of what they believe Lucy looked like from these few bone fragments. The truth is, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's not just apes and humans who don't have any intermediate life forms. No species does. And yet every science textbook will show chart after chart of progression from one species to another with absolutely no evidence, just like there is no evidence that Lucy is the missing link. A few bone fragments, and then suddenly the whole world believes that we have found the missing link. Well, I just want to say, not so fast. Again and again and again, we see headlines touting that the missing link has been found, and quite often, with regularity, these claims are quickly debunked. Let me just give you an example. April 10th of 2006, and the italics show what I'm actually quoting. This time, the New York Times, USA Today, and other media outlets trumpeted the discovery of fossils near the North Pole, said to belong to a 375 million year old fish. Why do we care? The finding by a team of researchers led by Neil Sherbin of the University of Chicago initially was reported in Nature magazine on April 6. The fish, known as Tiktaalik, is, here it comes, wait for it, the long-sought missing link in the evolution of some fishes from water to a life walking on four limbs on land. Remember, it goes from fish to amphibians, from sea to land. The Times also described the fossils as being, and you're going to love this, widely seen by scientists as a powerful rebuttal to religious creationists who hold a literal biblical view on the origins and development of life. How dare they? Isn't it interesting that the New York Times can't just simply report that scientists found a skeleton and they think it may have certain implications, but the reporters must take it to the next level and say, see, those silly Christians are wrong again. Well, not so fast. Other scientists very quickly pointed out that Tiktaalik was well known from other fossils. It was a type of fish known as a lobe-end fish. And those little fins, this is an artist rendering again on the screen, were too delicate for walking. They were simply used for swimming. And there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever linking this fish to amphibians and the movement of one species in the sea to another species in the land. We just found a very interesting fossil, and now this pent-up speculation pours forth, the celebration that those silly Christians are wrong. We have found the missing link. Oh, wait, it goes on and on. From 2009 in The Guardian, let's look at the headline. Fossil Ida, extraordinary find is, quote, here it is again, the missing link in human evolution. Perfectly preserved fossil Ida, unveiled in New York today, provides unprecedented insight into our ancestry. And I just have to read this to you. Ida, one of the most complete primate fossils ever found, a 47 million year old human ancestor. Now, there's absolutely no evidence of that. They found an interesting skeleton, but now they're presenting as fact it is a human ancestor. No evidence of that whatsoever. Scientists have discovered an exquisitely preserved ancient primate fossil that they believe forms a crucial missing link between our own evolutionary branch of life and the rest of the animal kingdom. Why do you think there is such a desperate search to find these missing links? It's because they're missing. And scientists know, and reporters know, the media knows that if they can't find these missing links, then evolution falls like a house of cards. So they're so desperate to identify any fossil from the past as a missing link. The popular view, this is what you learn in public school science classes, is that humans evolved from apes. We're primates. And one reason often cited is that humans share approximately 90% of the same DNA as primates. But what they don't tell you is that we also share about 90% of the same DNA with mice. And yet nobody is trumpeting that we came in a direct line from mice, that mice was that final stage before before humans appeared. No, they go back to primates and say 90% of the DNA is the same, so we came from apes. They say that because we bear resemblances. We look like each other, sometimes act like each other, move like each other, and yet they base that on a scientific fact of DNA, which is really ridiculous considering the other 90%ers that we share. By the way, there is no fossil evidence supporting an evolutionary link with either with apes or with mice. So let's go back to the founder himself, Charles Darwin, the one who created the theory of evolution. And I will tell you, I'm kind of a fan of Charles Darwin. Unlike many scientists and media persons today, he had moments of real honesty and he didn't mind sharing them. And I think the conclusions that he drew were very honest conclusions from observations that he made, and with the knowledge that he had, trying to figure out how all this fit together, I can see how he came up with some of these conclusions. Now listen to what he himself said about the lack of fossil evidence for these missing links. Why then, he says, is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. We can't find it. The links are missing. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Wow, that was a moment of honesty. And I so wish that modern Darwinists would go back to the original Darwin and look what he said about his own theory, that we should be finding these missing links everywhere. Turn over a spade of dirt, there's going to be an intermediate form. But why, in Darwin's day, they could not find any? Well, they should be everywhere. They were nowhere. And I'm sure Darwin hoped that later discoveries, more archaeological digs, would turn up these missing links. But if Darwin were alive today and as honest today as he was in the 1800s when he made this statement, he would be severely disappointed. Stephen Jay Gould is one of my favorite Darwinists. Now, he's gone, died a number of years ago. God bless him. He was an atheist, paleontologist at Harvard, a prolific writer, and I have loved his writing. brilliant writer, such a smart guy, great insights, entertaining. I love The Flamingo Smile. I read this book in my 20s, which caused me to be such a fan. Stephen Jay Gould, who's not a Christian, does not believe in God at all. He is an evolutionist, but nevertheless, he too had an incredible moment of clarity and honesty when he said, "This history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism, inconsistent with this gradual evolution of one species to another. One, stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. No change, no evolution, no rat turning into a kangaroo. And then two, sudden appearance in any local species, in any local area. A species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed." Wow. So Stephen Jay Gould, highly respected Harvard Darwinist paleontologist, is saying the same thing that Darwin said in the 1800s. There is no fossil evidence for evolution. Why can't scientists today be as honest as Darwin was then and Gould is today? So if there's no fossil evidence for evolution, what does the fossil record show? It shows that almost all major groups of animal life appeared abruptly and fully formed in the Cambrian period, 500 to 600 million years ago. And this is true of both sea and land animals. We should also say air animals, birds. The fossil record, I'm quoting now, is so strong and the event so dramatic that it has become known as, quote, the Cambrian explosion, or biology's Big Bang. That's by Jonathan Wells. That description of all creatures coming into being in a relatively short amount of geologic time, fully formed, not evolving into other creatures, but coming onto the scene fully formed, and in many, many cases, departing the scene, becoming extinct, just as they had appeared fully formed. That is what the fossil record shows. And no credible scientist today will disagree with that. Now, many of these forms from the Cambrian period have become extinct, and many others have evolved through microevolution within the same species to adapt to environmental conditions. They look differently, but the origin of the species, to quote Darwin, started right here in the Cambrian period. So I want to ask the question, why are there no fossils of transitional life forms? Why couldn't Darwin find them? Why couldn't Gould find them? Why are there no forms that show evolution from simple life forms to more complex life forms, or from one species to another? We've already made the point that those fossils don't exist, but I want to go a little bit deeper on that subject and say, why don't they exist? I'm going to give you 4 reasons. These 4 reasons are found in the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Geisler and Turek. Much of what I'm sharing in this lesson comes from that book. It's fantastic. I cannot recommend it highly enough. But the authors identify 4 reasons why we'll never find the missing link. It will always remain missing. 1, genetic limits. 2, cyclical change. 3, irreducible complexity. And 4, non-viability of transitional forms. We're going to fly through these, so just buckle your seatbelt. First of all, genetic limits. Selective breeding can combine a schnauzer and a poodle to create a very cute schnoodle, but a schnoodle is still a dog. You cannot selective breed no matter how smart you are, no matter how much money you have, no matter how long the generations of your family have been doing selective breeding. You're never going to turn a dog into a cat. You're never going to turn a horse into a cow, right? No matter, with all of our brains and all of our experience, We can only cause microevolution changes. We cannot change one species into another. Now, scientists have tried that for decades and decades and decades using fruit flies. And the reason is fruit flies, their life cycle is very short. So you can go through generations and generations and generations of fruit flies very quickly to see if you can cause a species change. Undoubtedly, there have been links of fruit fly generations studied in the lab, thousands of generations, probably millions of generations. And guess what? Those fruit flies are still fruit flies. Scientists have not been able to create a macroevolution ever. So apparently, God has placed genetic limits on species so that micro variations can occur, but macro never. A horse can never become a cow. Two, cyclical change. And the graph you're seeing on the screen is from Darwin's original book, The Origin of the Species, showing finches, 4 different finches with different beak types that he observed on the Galapagos Islands on his around the world voyage. Darwin's evolution epiphany occurred in the Galapagos Islands when he observed that finches of the same species had evolved different beaks optimized for the seeds that they were eating. Those with the big, strong beaks would crunch down on the big, hard seeds. Those with the little beaks would forage on small seeds that were more easily broken and more easily eaten. And then we had the in-between finches with varying medium-sized beaks. But what Darwin saw was not evolution. And he wasn't there long enough on the islands, apparently, to make this observation. What he did not know is that the proportion of each type of finch varied with environmental conditions. In times of drought, the finches with the larger beaks thrived because they could open the toughest seeds. In wetter weather, finches with smaller beaks dominated because they could feed on the smaller seeds. There was no linear evolutionary development. I suspect Darwin thought it had been small beak to medium beak to bigger medium beak to finally the big hard beaks. But in fact, all these 4 different finches with different beak sizes were coexisting at the same time, but depending upon environmental conditions, one would become more prominent. There was an extended drought. Those with the big beaks could find food. They could eat it. They could reproduce. Their numbers would increase. But in wetter weather, when food was abundant, the smaller finches, man, they were busy, food was abundant, and their numbers swelled even larger than those of the large beaks. So it wasn't evolution, it was simply adaptation to environmental conditions. Irreducible complexity. And this may be the hardest concept that I share with you, but it's easier than you think. It's simply a fancy term referring to any complex system, an organ or a machine, which will not function if one part is removed or missing. So, easy example, remove the pistons and an engine will not run. It'll have lots of fancy parts left, but you can't remove one and have it still work. Okay, it's irreducible complexity. You have to have every single part for it to function. Just like the human hand, remove the muscles and the hand will no longer function. Even if the bones are there, the skin is there, nerves are there, but if there's no muscles, it's not going to squeeze. It has to have every single part in order to function. Well, every biological system, our heart, our eyes, our lungs, our nerves, all of those are irreducibly complex systems. And yet evolution will tell us that these systems evolved over time, as if an engine by itself, just say there was an oil pan, but you leave it in the garage long enough and the oil filter is going to attach itself and then the head gasket and then it's going to start working, even though these other parts aren't there, and it's not going to work. Let me see if I can make this a little bit clearer to you. I thought I was the inventor of irreducible complexity. There was a time in my life when I had this aha moment about evolution. And I didn't have the phrase irreducible complexity, but I got the concept and I thought it was original to me. I feel quite validated when I discovered that no, scientists were quite aware of this long before it occurred to me. But it occurred to me when I was reading a book by an evolutionist, and it might have been Stephen Jay Gould, by the way, where he was describing how the eyeball evolved. Remember, single cell amoeba eventually turns into creatures that have eyes. How did that happen? And the author that I was reading said, well, one member of the species probably just had a light spot on its head. It might have been colored green, but there was a light green spot on its head. And that light green spot made it more attractive to the female of the species, and they got together, and lots more of that species with light green spots, were reproduced. Now, how could the female even see the light green spot on the male's head if neither of them had eyeballs? But this was the theory. And that over time, that little light spot, as it spread among the species, gave it some type of competitive advantage. And maybe as the light came in, as the fish swam towards the surface of the ocean, these little mechanisms of the eyeball began to develop. Now, no sight could have happened. Remember, the eye is irreducibly complex. No sight could have happened until all of these features on your screen were present. And what that means is if even half of these things happened as described, the eyeball would not work. It would give no survival advantage to that creature whatsoever. It would not reproduce in greater numbers than others who did not have that light spot or that half-formed eye. Irreducible complexity says that organ has to be fully formed in order for it to give a competitive advantage to the creature that has it. And evolution doesn't show up that way. You don't get fully formed eyes, fully formed mouths, fully formed digestive systems. And all these stages on the way to having the fully formed system, none of them would have provided any advantage. So evolution collapses on itself because of its insistence upon gradualism, when irreducible complexity says no. If the eye can't see, it gives no advantage, and those characteristics will not be passed on to other generations. All right, let's talk about the last reason we're not finding these missing links, and it is the non-viability of transitional forms. All that simply means is that if there was some kind of missing link, there was a fish that developed jumping legs so that it could become a frog. In nature, freaks like that, they don't create survival advantages. They're quickly eliminated from the population. Think about an albino tiger. Those things happen occasionally. It's a freak of nature where they lose the pigment in their hair and they come out white. Do they survive in the wild? No. They survive only in zoos because in the wild they have no camouflage. Their prey sees them coming. And so freaks, or these transitional forms, don't provide competitive advantages. Quite the opposite. And let me just give you kind of a goofy example, but this is what evolution says. They say that reptiles evolved into a bird, or birds into reptiles. They're not quite sure. But either way, they say there was a reptibird. There was some creature that was, half scales and half feathers. Does that give that creature an advantage in either environment? Absolutely not. It would not survive. Transitional forms belong to fantasy, not to science. And as many people wondered, I think this is an absolutely legitimate question, where are today's transitional forms? Right? Why are not apes continuing to evolve into humans? Why don't we see these transitional forms, a half ape, half human? Why don't we see these half fish, half amphibian? Why do we only see fully formed creatures within their own species? And I know the evolutionists' response. They say, well, we are all in transition. We just don't see it because we live in time. But if we could see ourselves over the perspective of millions or billions of years, we would see that we are evolving into something else. But we've been here for millions of years. Why aren't we seeing it? There should be human beings in different stages of evolution. There should be birds at different stages of evolution, horses at different stages of evolution. And yet we don't see it. The missing link is missing in the fossil record, and it is missing in life as we know it today. Well, I want to wrap this up by going back to my original point that evolution is not so much a science issue as it is a religious issue, a faith issue. And to bolster this point, I want to quote one of the most famous evolutionary biologists of all time, Richard Lewontin, like Stephen Jay Gould, a very prolific writer in his day. And he was, in a very honest moment, was clear that rejection of God in favor of evolution is not a scientific conclusion, but a willful choice. His quote: "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. For we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Wow, there you have it. One of the premier evolutionists that the world has produced saying what we believe is patently absurd, but we're going to believe it anyway. We're going to choose it anyway because the alternative is God, and we cannot allow God into the picture. We cannot deal with even the possibility of his reality. And now I want to go one step deeper. Why do evolutionists, why do Darwinists not want to allow the divine foot in the door? What cannot they stand about the very possibility of the existence of God? Well, again, I'm going to go to them and quote their own words. Julian Huxley, famous Darwinist, quote, "The reason we have accepted Darwinism without proof is because we didn't want God to interfere with our sexual mores." Wow. Lee Strobel, skeptic, atheist, Darwinist, who went on a personal discovery to define truth and became a Christian, he said this about his previous life: "I was happy to latch onto Darwinism as an excuse to jettison the idea of God so I could unabashedly pursue my own agenda without moral constraints." And now an anonymous quote, Ron Carlson, who is a believer in God, not an evolutionist. He travels the country teaching the concepts that I have shared with you, some of them that I've shared with you today. He once presented, and there was a biology professor at this secular university who attended his presentation, and they went out to dinner afterwards. And Ron asked him what he thought of the presentation. And the biology professor said, "I can't argue with it. What you said about evolution was absolutely true." But then he explained why he wasn't changing his position. He said, "If there is no God and we all evolved from green algae, then I can sleep with whomever I want." Well, there you go. We heard from Richard Lewontin that evolution was patently absurd, but they were going to choose that over belief in God. And now we've heard three very honest, deeply real testimonies about why they don't want God in the picture. They want the freedom to live their own morals or immoral life. And again, I'm not judging anybody, but I'm saying let's understand where this near unanimous opinion in the scientific community comes from. It's not from science. It's from a desire to be their own God. And that is a faith choice. That is a religious choice, not a scientific choice. So let's wrap it up here. Can't belief in God and evolution coexist? Well, absolutely. Some people do believe in God, and they believe that he used evolution to bring life to its current form today. These persons are known as theistic evolutionists. They believe in God and evolution. They believe God used evolution as a tool. But, and here I'm putting the exclamation point, we must be aware that it is not science that's propping up evolutionary theory, but rather a desire to find an explanation for life that leaves out God. The key issue is not biology, it's not chemistry, it is morality. Where do I stand? I'm going back to the beginning. In the beginning, God. Well, thank you for joining me. We have more coming in this series, and I hope that you will come along as we explore reasons to believe. God bless you.